We've been studying Genesis, and we have seen that up till now we've been focusing on events. Although people have been mentioned, it has mostly been about events, major events, the creation, the formation of the heavens and the earth, the universe. That was followed by the fall, mankind in the Garden of Eden. Then we saw the universal flood cover the whole earth as God judged that entire generation. We saw God's response to rebellion in the confusion of languages and the scattering of peoples. As we turn to chapter 12, we turn a corner and there's a very distinct division. We will now be watching the forming of a nation, of Israel. And we turn from the studying of events to the studying of people. For the next 39 chapters, we will study the biographies of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Those four will dominate the landscape for the rest of the book of Genesis. In chapters 1 through 11, 2,000 years are covered. For the next 39 chapters, they'll only cover 350 years. In chapters 1 through 11, we followed 19 generations. And in just the next 16 chapters, we'll follow one man. That'll be Abraham, the father of faith. Now, as we go through tonight's lecture, we're going to see that God challenges men to hear and respond to his call in their lives. We'll start with an introduction to Abram. He's probably the most important person in the whole Bible after Jesus. He's claimed as a central figure by three major religions, by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. 3 times in the Bible, he's called a friend of God. He's called the father of faith. And in the book of Romans, we see a whole chapter is dedicated just to his example of faith. Now, before we get into Genesis 11, we're going to see that there's a couple other parts of the Bible that give us some insight into Abram's background. The first one is in Joshua 24, where Joshua says to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. Abraham grew up in Ur, the capital city of ancient Sumer, where there was about 300,000 people in a walled city. It was a highly advanced culture with music, instruments, crafts, libraries, a university. They were very advanced in astronomy and in mathematics. I heard that this is actually the place where the first bathtub was invented. It was also a center of idol worship. In the center of the city, there was a huge temple tower, a ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god, whose name actually coincidentally is Sin. In fact, Abraham's father's name, Terah, means moon. So I guess we could call Abraham one of the first Moonies. Continuing in Joshua 24, it says, "But I took your father, Abraham, from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants." Joshua points out that God sovereignly takes Abram out of this idol-worshiping culture and through him begins to build a nation that will worship him. So right away, we see that we are going to be studying a story of God's regenerating work. Abraham and his family were idol worshipers and were pagans, and yet God puts a call on Abraham's life and guides him to worship, trust, and be used for his purpose. And the same is true in our lives. Even though the world around us teaches us to look out for number one and that we know what's best for our own lives, the story of Abraham teaches us that God calls us to a new life. Abram grew up in Ur, a city known for wealth, power, and idolatry. He was chasing after things he thought were good. Just like men today, Abram did not know what was best for him. Like Abram, our lives are full of good things that can blind us to the satisfaction only found in our Creator God through Christ. Just as Abram was called to a new life following God, so are we. Anything we place ahead of God in our life is an idol. So as we read of Abraham uprooting his life and risking his safety and security in order to follow God's call on his life, I'm challenging all of us to ask ourselves, what part of our lives seem too important to risk surrendering them to God? How might God be calling you into a deeper relationship with him? As we move back into Genesis 11, we right away see 2 great tragedies or afflictions in Abram's life. The first we find in 11:28. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Abram loses a brother early on in life. This event surely caused the whole family much grief and required them to take up the responsibility of caring for their dead brother's son, Lot. The second tragedy we see early in Abraham's life, we see in verse 30. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Abraham's wife, Sarah, was barren. She seemingly could have no children. This reality would have carried a great cultural stigma for both Abram and Sarai. Later in Genesis, we will read of a woman named Leah calling her time of barrenness a type of affliction. It's later on in chapter 29 of Genesis. Verse 32 says, "And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me." Abraham's wife, Sarai, had not become pregnant in their many years of marriage. This reality would have been particularly painful for Abram in light of the fact that his name literally means exalted father or father of many. Abram, the man named exalted father of many, has no children. So right away we see that he has two great tragedies or afflictions in his life. And yet it will be this afflicted and idol-worshiping life that God chooses to use to create his own people or nation. While he's still in Ur in Mesopotamia, God calls him to a new life. We get some more insight into this in Acts chapter 7, verse 1, when Stephen is speaking before the Sanhedrin and says, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. Leave your country and your people," God said, "and go to the land I will show you." We then pick up the story back in Genesis 11, where we read in verse 31, "Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan." It is interesting here to note that the passage from Acts says it is Abram to whom God appears and tells to leave your country and your people and to go to the land I will show you. But when we turn to this passage in Genesis, it presents his father Terah as the one who takes the initiative. Abram is not leading on this move. Furthermore, he's with his father and his nephew. Abraham has not left his people at this point. And then on top of that, we read that, but when they came to Haran, they settled there. When I read the word settle there, well, it was like deja vu all over again. I mean, it made me think about the people who settled in Babylon and tried to build a tower rather than continuing to fill the whole earth. In the same way, we see here that Abraham has been told to go on to Canaan, but settles in Haran for a while. Here will be interesting to note that Haran can be translated as a place of delay. Moving on to the beginning of chapter 12, we read, "The Lord had said to Abram." Abram will hear God or from God 7 times in 100 years. This is actually the first time we see God speaking in about 500 years since when he was talking to Noah. Sometimes God is silent. Here he breaks his silence by telling Abram to go from your country, your people, and your father's household. God wanted Abram to separate from the pagan culture that he grew up in. We become more like those around us. Therefore, we should make friends with the fact that to become a Christian is to live a life of separating ourselves from the culture we live in. We should learn to be in the world, but not of it. We should be comfortable saying we're different, and even take it a step further by harnessing the power of peer pressure in a good way, deliberately read and study the lives of people we can look up to and admire. God is telling Abram to go to the land that God will show him. The Lord told Abram, "You just start walking." Have you ever been in a situation and thought to yourself, if the Lord would just tell me what to do, I just want to know what his perfect will is. So often we don't know in the time. He doesn't map it all out at once. But many times he does start us out by telling us he wants us to separate ourselves from our surroundings. Here we see a truth, and that is that God calls us to a new life of following him, and that he calls us to put down the lie that we know what's best for our lives. Here we have our first division. Abram, descendant of Shem, received God's call to Canaan. And our first principle is, all God's people receive new life by grace through faith. Moving on to 12:2, we read, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and now whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." It is in these first 2 verses that we first hear the promises. God says, "I will" 3 times. I will make you into a great nation, I will make your name great, and I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. God says to Abram, I'm going to do something. I'm going to make you a nation. I'm going to give you a name and protect you. God tells Abram, you're going to have primacy, you're going to have identity, you're going to have security. Primacy in that I'm going to make you a great nation and give you a great purpose. Identity in that you're going to know who you are and security, and that I'm going to protect you. God sovereignly, graciously, and mercifully says to Abraham, I'm going to just give you these things if you just follow me. Leave your family, leave your country, and follow me, and these things will come your way. It turns out that these are the very three things that man wanted so desperately in chapter 11. Those men sought primacy in their effort to build a tower reaching to heaven. They sought to make a name for themselves, and they sought security from being scattered across the whole earth. In their own energy, they wanted primacy, identity, and they wanted security. And they meant to do it from themselves. Let us, let us, let us. But here we read of God saying, I will do these things for you, Abraham, if only you will follow and believe. God then says that he will bless the world through Abram and says, you shall be a blessing. He commands Abram to be a blessing. Moving on to verse 4, it says, so Abram went as the Lord had told him. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. Abram seems to have acquired a great deal of wealth in the place of delay. I wonder if that was the result of some deliberate demonic strategy to keep Abram from moving on into Canaan. In the New Testament, we read of Satan tempting Jesus and essentially saying that he had the riches of the world to offer to whomever he chose, and Jesus doesn't dispute this claim. Maybe Satan was attempting to lull Abram into forgetting the path of obedience, trying to lull him into forgetting about Canaan by giving him all this wealth. Verse 7 says, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. Here we read God, in a sense, up the ante for Abraham in the language that he uses. He goes from speaking generally of making Abraham a great nation to using the word offspring. He's telling Abraham he's going to have offspring and that God is going to bless them. In light of everything we just talked about Abraham and the idea of offspring, I imagine that this word probably hit a nerve for Abraham, probably made the bottom drop out of his stomach. It reminds me of Elisha with the childless Shunammite woman in 2 Kings 4, how she flinched and protested when Elisha prophesied that she would have a son, essentially saying, Elisha, please don't do anything so cruel as to get my hopes up about a child. And again, later in the story, when she brings her dead son's body to Elisha, she protests in bitterness of heart and rebukes Elijah for raising her hopes by giving her a child only to have him die in her arms. Knowing all this about Abram, keeping in mind how loaded with anxiety and disappointment the idea of offspring was for Abraham, it helps us to much better appreciate what we see him do at the end of this verse. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. We see Abram build an altar in two different places. Here it might be good to reflect that to build an altar is more than just taking out your screw gun and skill saw and tape measure and putting together a physical structure. It means to, on purpose, take a humble posture to God with our lives, to regularly say out loud to God and ourselves that he exists and is good and knows what is best and how to live life. Here Abram is doing exactly what we see Mary, the mother of Jesus, do when the angel tells her what a wonderful thing is about to happen to her in her giving birth to Jesus. She responds by saying, may it be unto me as you have said. Abram, by building the altars and calling on the name of the Lord, is saying the same thing. It's the same thing to God. May it be unto me as you have said. This is where we very powerfully see his faith in action. And this brings us to our second division. Abram moved forward to Canaan by faith. And our second principle is, new life makes experiencing God's presence possible. As men, we can often struggle to admit we are lost and need direction. We often believe that if we do not know exactly what to do or where to go, we forfeit trust and respect. We see dependency as weakness to overcome. Along these lines, I think of the label of con man or a con game. Here, con is short for confidence. Those who exude confidence, who are sure of themselves, who seem to know what they're talking about, who speak authoritatively, wind up being much more convincing to the rest of us. And God does, in a sense, want us to be confident, to be strong and courageous. But the difference is in the object of the confidence. Are we trusting? Are we boasting in our own strength or wisdom and ability? Or are we boasting in the Lord and in our dependence on him, as Abram did? This is the work that God does in us, to grow us in our trust in his leading and in his strength. The Lord regenerates us through planting faith within us. This is the faith that caused Abram to travel to an unknown land. God leads his people by his word and his spirit. Abram built his life on God's promises and taught his family to call upon the Lord in dependence and worship. How do you respond when you do not know what to do next? What do those responses reveal about what's most important to you? Moving on, we're going to move to verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And here's something for us to notice. While Abram was in Haran, before he got to the place God had told him to go, we see him greatly prospering. Then, afterward, when he leaves the promised land, we will see him again greatly benefiting in the gifts he receives from Pharaoh. But in between, when he's in the sweet spot of obedience, we see him face adversity. I don't for sure know if it was wrong for Abram to go to Egypt during the famine, but I'm pretty sure we can say he would not have been wrong to stay in Canaan. And from an obedience standpoint, that would have been the safest choice. Sometimes obedience means to lean into adversity. We do not read of Abram praying about this decision. I wonder if to do so would have been like Jonah stopping to pray about heading into the opposite direction from Nineveh, or if it would have been like Jonah praying for protection as he got on that boat on his journey away from Nineveh. Verse 11 says, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Hopefully this wasn't the first time he had mentioned this, but when he says it here, it's for the purpose of buttering her up for the plan he has in mind. Verse 12 says, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. This is a legitimate fear for Abram. Kidnapping and wife abduction were not uncommon in Abram's world. Verse 13 says, say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. We later learn that this is in part true, that Abram is in fact Sarah's half-brother. The sin lies in the fact that Abram is also Sarah's full husband. And the story they tell Pharaoh is meant to conceal this fact. As I read this, I wondered to myself, okay, that's going to work for a while, but what was the rest of the plan? I was automatically assuming that there was also a part B of the plan where Abram and Sarai were reunited. But maybe Abram thought this was a perfect off-ramp for his marriage to Sarah. She was, after all, a barren woman, and God had said that Abram was to have a whole nation of descendants. Was Abram thinking God meant for him to marry someone else to fulfill the promise? Maybe this whole situation was a way to give Sarai a place for a soft landing as a mistress or a wife of a pharaoh. And while she apparently had a lot of game and was physically attractive and could hold her own, I can't imagine there were many other 65-year-olds there in that harem. Of course, we're reading the story with the benefit of seeing the rest of Abraham's life and reading of other places where God had deliberately had to spell it out for him that he meant for the promise to be fulfilled through Sarah. In Genesis 18, he speaks through an angel and says, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. What Abram does here is wrong, and he should know it, and it will jeopardize God's greater plan of blessing the whole world with a Messiah. And yet, he seems to actually benefit from it. In verse 16, we read, he treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. Pharaoh gives him all kinds of stuff, and Abram keeps it. It's weird. He's being disobedient, and yet on the surface, it seems as though God's blessing him. How do we explain that? I think it's called grace. Also, it turns out that later, a lot of this material wealth brings considerable misery to Abram's world. This is where he will have acquired Hagar, which leads to much strife in his house later on. Also later on, we will see the result of all this wealth being that he'll have to separate from his nephew Lot. All the travels and adversity they had faced together couldn't separate them, but their wealth will later on. And from there, Lot moves to Sodom, where his daughters learns all kinds of weird sexual stuff that they would have never learned if they'd stayed with Abram in the wilderness. They get their dad drunk, and then we have the Moabites and the Ammonites who will be a thorn in the flesh of the Israelites for many generations to come. It also leads to Lot losing his wife. And in 2 times in the New Testament, we read that Lot was a righteous man. As we list out all these events that can be connected to Abram's getting all this wealth, first in Haran and then in Egypt, it seems as though a strong argument could be made that all this material wealth has the aroma of being cursed on it. So Sarah's in Pharaoh's palace, and the Lord's plan is in jeopardy. If Sarah marries Pharaoh, there's no Isaac, no Jacob, no David, no Jesus. Through this couple, Abram and Sarai, the world is to be blessed. God won't allow all that to be jeopardized. In verse 17, the Lord acts, but the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarah. Somehow through this situation, God either directly tells Pharaoh why this is happening or directs Pharaoh to ask Sarah why this is happening, because the next thing we read is of him, and he's summoning Abraham to his presence and justifiably rebuking Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say to me, she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here's your wife, take her and go." Through verses 18 to 20, we see the word wife being used 4 times. Abram's deliberately concealing from Pharaoh his marriage to Sarah could have been avoided if he had sought the Lord before considering Egypt as a way out of facing adversity and famine in Canaan. That's why we need to pray and seek the leading of the Lord and not just be driven by the circumstances of life. Just like men in today's world, Abram had to lead his family through a crisis, through the famine. When he moved them to Egypt, his fear of Pharaoh led him to lie to protect himself. Men who rely on their own solutions rather than seeking God's wisdom face anxiety and uncertainty over the future. God is merciful. He allows hardships to reveal our sin and weakness. God's mercy provides direction and growth despite our sin. What is the hardship in your life revealed about your need for God? In what ways is fear causing you to make bad decisions because you're not trusting God? And finally, we come to our 3rd division. Abram acted deceitfully in Egypt, but God protected him. Our 3rd principle is, new life does not exempt God's people from the need to trust God. So, guys, I hope you're blessed by that lecture, and I pray that you're blessed by your fellowship tonight, and I pray you have a great week.